Hello, I'm Brian Simmons. Welcome to Module 4 of Interpersonal Communication. The topic today, gender communication, everyday differences. What I'd like to do today is to share with you 9 different ways in which the different genders communicate in vastly different manners. We said earlier that males and females in the communication research are shown to often follow different lenses to understand communication. The male lens is a lens of hierarchy, where communication is intended to put yourself in a one-up position or put someone else in a one-down position. For females, on the other hand, research indicates that they often see communication through a connective lens, where communication is intended to foster and maintain connections between people. Well, today we're going to look at some research that finds 9 different ways in which those different lenses manifest themselves in everyday communication. And I think as we talk about this research, you'll be able to see many of your own experiences shine through. Let's start with this. Several years ago, I knew a newly married couple. They had been married for about 2 months or so, and the money was tight. She had a job that was long and hard. He also had a job that worked many hours and was a difficult kind of a job that brought him much satisfaction, but he was really tired when he got home. And so the guy felt that he needed a bit of a stress relief. And so even though money was tight for the two of them, not much extra money to spend on stuff beyond rent and groceries and utilities and things like that, the guy decides to go out and join a gym. And it's not Planet Fitness where you pay by the month at $10 or so each month. Instead, it's the kind of gym that requires an extended commitment, a 6-month membership, cash up front. So the guy decides he's going to join a gym. And so one day after work, he stops off at the gym, pays the money, and gets his 6-month membership. So he comes home that evening and he says to his wife, "Hey, guess what? I joined the gym today." And he was super excited about it, looking forward to working out and reducing stress and all of that. As you might imagine, his wife was not happy about that. You see, she felt that now that they were married, the two of them would have conversations about how the money was to be spent, especially since money was so tight and a 6-month commitment to a gym was a pretty big deal. An argument ensued, and neither one of them was happy. Well, this story illustrates the first of the many ways that the genders communicate differently in everyday interactions. Let's talk about decisions and how males and females often see decisions differently, and therefore they communicate differently about those decisions. Because females see the world through a lens of connection, it makes sense to them that people would consult one another before decisions are made. While this is especially true in significant relationships like marriages, it's also true in other kinds of contexts as well. For example, many females will talk to several of their friends and get their opinion before they decide to get their hair cut. They'll ask them things like, should I cut it or not? Should I change the style? Should I get highlights? This and that. And they may well talk to several people before actually deciding what to do about their hair. Males, on the other hand, tend not to talk to other people before they get a haircut. The fact of the matter is, for males, the consultation before a decision is made is a rather rare one. Not to say that it never happens, it just doesn't happen as often as females do. If females see the lens of connection as the key to communication, it makes perfectly good sense that they would want to talk to as many people as possible before getting a haircut. Or it makes sense that a wife might expect her husband to speak with her before he runs off and gets a gym membership. But in the male world of hierarchy, consultation for making a decision is not necessary. In fact, to have to talk to somebody before you make a decision runs the risk of placing yourself in a one-down position. It's almost as if the husband had to ask his wife's permission to go and get a gym membership. And in his mind, that might have placed him in a one-down position to his wife. So what we find then is that when it comes to making decisions, oftentimes males and females will communicate very differently about it. Females expect communication, whereas males are less likely to give it. And so therefore, in the story I told you about the gym membership with the husband and the wife, there's no way that that conflict might have been avoided if they stick with their lenses. But if the husband had realized that his wife sees the world through a lens of connection, he would have consulted her before getting the gym membership. Not only would that have been good financial management, it would have been good for the marriage because the wife probably would have felt validated and would have seen the husband's consulting with her as a positive kind of a thing. Well, the second kind of everyday interaction is a pretty common one, even stereotypic. It's that males never ask for directions when they're driving. You might have experienced this yourself. Many of my female students will talk about how their boyfriends or their fathers or some other male figure in their life will be driving around seemingly lost and refuse to go to Google Maps and get directions. Alternatively, they'll be in a large store like a Home Depot or something, and the guy won't quite know where to find a particular product, but rather than asking someone in the orange apron, they wander about the store hoping to stumble onto what they're looking for. That's a bit of a cultural trope, the kind of thing where we say, well, that's the stereotype. Yet the fact is, research finds that the second area in which males and females often differ in communication addresses assistance. Because males see the world through a hierarchical lens, they are loath, very slow to ask for assistance. I mean, think about it. If you see the world through the lens of hierarchy and you walk into a Home Depot, you see someone there in an orange apron. And if you're not sure where to go, that places you in a one-down position. The person with the orange apron is in a one-up position. So if you ask for directions, you're stuck in that position. But if you're wandering through the store and you have a general idea of where things might be, or you act as if you knew where that product might be, then you put yourself in a one-up position. Now, sadly, what many males don't realize is that as they're wandering through the Home Depot looking for their product, or as they're wandering around town trying to find their destination, refusing to use Google Maps, they're actually placing themselves in a one-down position because their girlfriend, their sister, their wife, their mother, whomever that female is, understands he's lost, and that puts him, in her mind, in a one-down position. So for males, asking for assistance is all too often equated with a deficiency of some kind. And so therefore, they're more sensitive to the idea of asking for assistance. But beyond that, males tend to have a much broader categorization of what counts as assistance. So for a male, any asking for advice, any asking for help, any asking for assistance places him in a one-down position. You might have seen this if you've ever helped someone move out of an apartment or a house. I've helped many people move in my life, and there have been so many times when I'll see some guy with a big, heavy box or a big, heavy piece of furniture, and it's obvious that he's struggling beneath the weight of it. And so someone will say, hey, do you need some help with that? But the guy will say, no, I got it, as he wobbles his way toward the truck. The fact of the matter is, in that moment, asking or accepting the offer of assistance is part of that big category of being placed in a one-down position. For females, it just makes sense. If you're carrying a heavy object and someone offers help, allow them to help you. Not only does that make the carrying of the object easier, it also creates a kind of connection, which satisfies the female need for connection in their lens on the world. And so therefore, females, compared to males, are more commonly accepting assistance. They're more likely to accept it when it's offered. They're more likely to offer that assistance because for them, it makes perfectly good sense. So a third way that the basic gender differences of communication can be manifest has to deal with what's called repeated requests. Here's an example of how that works. When you were younger, you might have seen this transpire between your mom and your brother. Your brother's room might not have been very clean, so your mom says to your brother, hey, clean this room up. Your brother decides he doesn't want to clean his room. Maybe he likes it messy. Maybe he's just lazy. Who knows what? But he doesn't clean his room. So mom says to the son even more loud, clean your room. Mom gets irritated. And she says it a third time about 20 minutes later. I told you to clean your room. She repeats and repeats and repeats her requests for her son to clean his room. Now, you might chalk that up simply to mothers and sons, and that's oftentimes littered with conflict, especially in the teenage years. But let's craft a different example that exemplifies the same basic principle. So, let's say that a boyfriend and girlfriend at Oklahoma Christian have been dating for a while, and it's really important that the guy try and get an internship because he's going to be graduating at the end of the semester. And both he and his girlfriend think it's important for him to have an internship. And so, in particular, because the girlfriend wants the guy that she's dating to have a really good job, she starts to bug him about the internship. And so each day when they meet for lunch, she says, have you applied for internships? Have you followed up with the internship? Have you updated your LinkedIn? Have you done anything with the internship? And after a while, the guy starts to get really frustrated. It bugs him that she is bugging him about the internship. And so it causes friction and maybe a little bit of conflict. What's going on here? Well, the centerpiece of this example, both the one with the mom and the son and the one with the boyfriend and girlfriend, is the repeated request. You see, because the male and female lens of communication is different, males and females tend to see the act of repeating requests in a very different way. For females, when you are repeating a request, you see that as a positive thing because it has the effect of putting into bold or underlining the importance of that request. The more I repeat the request, the more likely I am to communicate to you, hey, this is important. So every time the mom says to the son, you really need to clean your room, come on, clean your room, I told you to clean your room, she is highlighting the importance of cleaning the room in her mind. The son, on the other hand, sees it differently. For males, on the other hand, because they tend to see the world through the lens of hierarchy, having to hear a repeated request puts them in a one-down position. In fact, there's a term that is often used for repeated requests, nag. The boyfriend might say to the girlfriend, stop nagging me about the internship. Now, framing the repeated request as a nag is to make those repeated requests be seen as a negative kind of a thing. That's why the term nag is used. It has a negative connotation to it. So what's happening here is that in the male realm of hierarchy, the repeated request is labeled as a nag, which allows the male in his mind to have a one-up position, because after all, he's not nagging, and because the mom or the girlfriend is repeating the request, and that's a negative thing, that places them in a one-down position. Alternatively, because the repeated request is underlying something that the male didn't do, the male resists being placed in that one-down position. So the resistance to cleaning the room or the resistance to actually following up with the internship is the kind of thing the male doesn't want to have to do because it places him in a one-down position. It's almost like he loses control by having to act on the request to clean the room or to do something about the internship. And so pushing back against those requests is a way for a male to preserve freedom, to preserve independence, and to maintain position in a one-up kind of position. And so therefore what ends up happening is that the repeated request becomes something that females often use with males to underlie importance, whereas males tend to see it as an infringement on their freedom. Also, it explains why compared to females, males are less likely to nag, less likely to repeat their requests, because they understand it's not likely to yield additional benefit. In my family communication class, in fact, I talk about this, and I talk about how in that research, moms are more likely than fathers to repeatedly make requests of their children. Fathers are more likely to make one request and then act in some kind of a punishment or disciplinary manner if that request is not acted on. Moms, on the other hand, are more likely to repeat their requests. And so after a while, what happens is kids begin to figure out, if mom asks me to clean the room, I can put it off for a couple of whiles. But if my dad asks me to clean the room, I better get it done quickly. Well, a fourth kind of common interaction that shows the differences between the male lens and the female lens is what's called class clowns. You might have seen this in particular in your younger years when you were in elementary school, junior high, or high school. Someone, often in an educational setting, plays the role of the class clown. Now, I've also seen this in other contexts as well. I've been in a couple of different Bible classes where one of the males in the class will play the role as the class clown. He always has some kind of a funny comment to make. He always has a zinger to add or some kind of a bad pun. The notion of being a class clown is when you're using humor in a very public, visible way to draw attention to yourself. Well, if that's what we mean by a class clown, the differences between males and females when it comes to class clowns become quite clear. A lot of research has been done both in the educational context and in other contexts that finds that males are far more likely to act in a way that's a class clown than are females. Or to put it differently, far more class clowns are male than female. Why is that? Well, once again, we return to the basic distinction of a connective lens for females and a hierarchical lens for males. In the male realm, if it is about hierarchy, and if communication is all about trying to establish where you are in the hierarchy, to place yourself in a one-up position, then it makes sense that acting as a class clown allows a male in a classroom setting to put himself in a one-up position. If in a Bible class, for example, a guy can make a comment that gets the rest of the group to laugh, then he's placed himself in a one-up position. And so therefore there's a benefit to playing the role of the class clown. By the way, one explanation for why this happens is what's called a depravity hypothesis. And the idea is that oftentimes males feel they're at a disadvantage of some kind. The word depravity means you lack something. So for example, in a Bible class, if the guy doesn't know as much about the Bible or doesn't quite feel like he's equipped to chime in on a particular topic, he might jump in with something funny because that allows him to move from a position where not knowing as much he's one down, but getting people to laugh, he's one up. And so functionally, playing the role of the class clown is quite useful to males because it allows them to jockey for that status and to place themselves in a one-up position or to prevent themselves from being mired in a one-down position. On the other hand, females are less likely to play the role of class clown because seeing the world through a connective lens, they're more likely to be self-conscious when the spotlight is turned on them. And again, we're not saying that females never act as class clowns. They do. As we've said previously about all these gender differences, it's not as if females are exclusive connective lens people, and it's not like males are exclusively hierarchical lens people. Instead, there's a proclivity to it, a kind of a tendency to it, based upon people's experiences and personality and background and context and all of that. But generally speaking, females tend not to play the role of the class clown because to do so runs the risk of breaking connection. It runs the risk of embarrassing yourself or putting yourself in a situation where you're not seen in a positive light. Now, by the way, here on the notion of class clowns, we begin to see the overlap between the idea that we are not exclusively connective or hierarchical lens people. I said earlier that if you draw a pie graph, it's true that for females, the largest slice of their communicative style is to see the world through a connective lens. But there is some slice of that pie that's concerned about hierarchy. And so oftentimes for females, we see the hierarchical emphasis on display when it comes to class clowns. Because if you try and become a class clown and it's successful, there's a lot of reward there. But if you try to become the class clown and you fail, it's bad. You're in a one-down position. And so therefore what we find is that for females, the risk to reward ratio is such that the risk is perceived to be higher than the reward. But for the male, who more often sees the world through a hierarchical lens, the risk to reward ratio is quite high, meaning the benefits of becoming a class clown far outweigh the risks, at least in the eyes of the male. So the next time you're in a college classroom, take a look around. Ask yourself who the class clown is, and then think about this research that we've just talked about. Well, the next way that we see the gender lenses played out in everyday interactions is oftentimes seen in this example. A lot of my female students will say that their boyfriends sometimes are really annoying to them for doing this. Let's say that a girl and a guy are together and a couple of the guy's friends are around and maybe a couple of the female's friends as well. A big group of people, 6 or 7 of them at a table in the cafeteria. So the guys begin to talk about sports. And the guys begin to argue about whether Michael Jordan is better than LeBron James or whether the old classic NBA player Bill Russell is better than both of them. So you've got a couple of guys arguing on behalf of Michael Jordan, another couple of guys arguing on behalf of LeBron James, and one guy, a lone voice, arguing that it's Bill Russell. It's a pretty common kind of argument that occurs in a lot of places. Now, the females are listening to this, and they get the impression that at least 1 or 2 of the guys in this particular conversation isn't quite as knowledgeable as the other guys are. And so it becomes pretty obvious that there's an argument going on now, and it sure does seem to the females as if they're arguing just to argue. It might be that the males don't really care about that topic. It might be that 1 or 2 of them don't know a great deal about that topic, but yet they continue to argue, and in some ways, quite vehemently. Voices are raised, emotions are stirred up, passions run high. And so the females at the table just kind of get quiet, or they just kind of roll their eyes, or they have a sidebar conversation. And after a while, 1 or 2 of them, especially the girlfriend in this example, just wants it to end. A lot of my female students tell me their boyfriends sometimes argue just to argue. Argue with them, argue with their friends, argue with the teacher. They argue just to argue. Well, we can explain that in part because of the lenses we've talked about thus far. For males in a world of hierarchy, arguing just to argue is quite a positive kind of a thing. Because you see, if you're arguing just to argue, that becomes an arena where you might make yourself into a one-up position. Even if you don't know a lot about what you're talking about, even if it's obvious you're losing the argument, even if what you're saying is stupid and makes no sense, you press on and continue to argue, because to stop arguing admits defeat and places yourself in a one-down position. But to continue to argue propagates the facade, or maybe the truth, that you can win this argument, and you can place yourself in a one-up position. And so for many males, what ends up happening is they continue to argue just to argue. Now, what's interesting to me about this is that when you drop this into the romantic relationship context, you oftentimes end up with what's called an argument culture. An argument culture occurs when a guy and a girl are in a relationship, and the guy does argue just to argue. And what ends up happening is he challenges many of the things that the female says. It becomes a kind of common exchange where she'll say something, he'll push back against it. And it turns into this argument. And even though the guy might not care, or even though the argument has been lost long ago, there's a continuance of arguing to argue. And so part of the common pattern of interaction in the guy and the girl's relationship is this constant argument. And it might not even matter to the guy. It just becomes a common kind of an appearance. And so that becomes what's called an argument culture. And it all stems from the basic male lens of wanting to be in a one-up and not wanting to be in a one-down position. In the female realm, however, that perspective of connection makes arguing to argue a threat. And so females are less likely to argue just to argue. They're less likely to want to prolong a conversation if it's obvious that they're not getting anywhere. If the conflict begins to get too heated or too emotional, females are more likely to back off and want to end that interaction. See, the fact of the matter is, for many females, arguing just to argue isn't functional. It's not beneficial. In fact, quite the opposite. Not only is it a threat, it can oftentimes fray or damage connection. And so therefore, arguing to argue is to be avoided. Now, that's not to say that females don't ever want to argue. Certainly they do, in particular if the issue is important enough to them. But the fact of the matter is that they tend to be better at males at knowing when to stop the argument, when to bail out of it, or when to curtail it, because they see there comes a point of diminishing returns where after you've argued for a while, it's just not worth it. By the way, related to this is another research finding that says that females are more likely to adopt a negative term to describe an argument, or they think they're arguing just to argue. So, for example, here are some synonyms that might be used to describe some kind of a conflict between a boyfriend and a girlfriend. It could be conflict, it could be an argument, it could be a discussion, it could be a conversation. Let's just stick with those four. Of those three, I would think that argument might be the harshest of them. Conversation might be the softest of them. But if we add a fifth one and say fight, so now in perhaps descending order, fight is the most negative, followed by argument, followed perhaps by conflict, then discussion, then conversation. Well, what the research finds is that when males are arguing just to argue, the term that females use to describe that situation is typically a harsher, more negative one, like argument or fight. Males, on the other hand, are more likely to attach a less negative, more neutral kind of a term, like conversation or discussion or conflict. So at the end of the day, what ends up happening is that the way that males and females see arguing just to argue and what actually happens when that argument unfolds reflects the different lenses of hierarchy versus connection. Well, the next common interaction is a very common one indeed. It's listening. The basic gender differences of hierarchy versus connection are often really easily seen when you think about listening. Now, we know that listening is a pretty common occurrence. In fact, there's some research that finds that people spend the majority of their days when they're in public in a listening kind of a mode. Right now, you're listening to me on this video. What we find then is that for females, seeing the world through a connective lens, the act of listening is typically perceived to be a very positive one. In fact, listening to someone else for females is a way of demonstrating connection. On top of that, it's a way of actually fostering that connection. If a female's listening to you, it's an indication both verbally and symbolically that in fact their connection has been made. And so for females, listening is often seen as a kind of contract. I'll listen to you now, you listen to me later. And so earlier when we talked about the research on troubles talk, we said that for many females, they would share conversations about their troubles, about their difficulties. And so if Susan comes and wants to talk to Melissa about the struggles that Susan is having in her math class, the expectation on Melissa's part is that she'll listen to Susan. She'll let her vent, she'll validate her concerns, and maybe offer some advice. But then when Melissa shifts and begins to talk about the difficulties she's experiencing in her own history class, the expectation is that Susan will listen to her and provide the same kind of validation and perhaps advice. See, there's a contract there. So when the contract is broken, there's a problem. If, for example, Susan were not to listen to Melissa and instead just unload, invent, and run away, then the contract would be broken. Now, males tend not to see listening as a contractual kind of a thing at all. They tend to see it as a functional kind of thing. For males, the basic attitude is, I'll listen to you if I think what you have to say is important. And so females tend to see the basic act of listening as a responsibility, a way of acknowledging connection. Whereas for males, the act of listening is seen through the lens of whether it's useful or not, and more narrowly, through the lens of whether the male deems if it is likely to be important enough to be useful. So at the end of the day, there's no sense of a contract on the part of the male. The male might vent or unload or complain or whine or who knows what, but the girlfriend or the wife listens. And then when the wife begins to talk about her own difficulties, or when the wife begins to shift to a different topic, the husband or the boyfriend might get distracted and he might not listen. And in fact, from there's likely to be some kind of a tension or conflict. Beyond that, males often see the act of listening as putting themselves into a one down kind of a position. Because if you're listening, you're not controlling the conversation. If you're listening, you're in a situation where you can't put yourself into a one-up situation. Now, if you listen long enough, for example, you might be able to offer advice which places you into a one-up position. But generally speaking, compared to females, males are more apt to see the act of listening itself as placing them in a one-down position. You might have noticed this if, for example, you look at athletic contexts. One of the things we know is that when coaches yell at their athletes, the athletes will often respond in a very common kind of a way. They won't look at the coach. They'll look down at the ground. They'll look away from the coach. They do that as a way to push back against having to listen. Because if the coach says, "Hey, eyes on me," and begins to yell at the athletes, then the athlete is forced into a one-down position. They might fidget a little bit, but they have to make eye contact. They have to be present in the moment, and that puts them in a one-down situation to the coach. Now, if the coach doesn't require the athlete to look at him or her, then at least by looking away or by fidgeting or by doing something else, the athlete begins to push back a little bit and in his mind gain at least a minor, small kind of a one-up position. The act of being yelled at still places the athlete in a one-down position. Don't get me wrong, but pushing back a little bit helps, and it creates the impression that the male has some control when in fact he may not have control at all. Now, related to that is another idea. Stereotypically, we often hear females say to the men in their life, "You're not listening to me." And when males hear that statement, males typically want to respond with, "Well, I will repeat back what you just said." So if a girlfriend and boyfriend are talking about what their plans are for the weekend, the guy seems to be distracted. Maybe he's trying to play video games at the same time that his girlfriend is talking to him. So if the girlfriend says to him, "Hey, you're not listening to me," the guy will say, "I am listening," and he'll try and repeat back what she just said. You see, again, for males, listening is a functioning kind of a thing. If what you're saying is important, then I'm listening. If what you're saying isn't important, I'm not listening, or I'm only paying partial attention. And so for males, the way to validate whether or not someone is listening is to repeat back what was just said. For females, that's not the way that you validate listening. Males and females tend to have different kinds of expectations for what happens when listening occurs. For females, the expectation is that there'll be some kind of verbal or nonverbal feedback to indicate that someone is listening. So for example, if the male is playing video games, the female would expect him to demonstrate that he's listening by saying uh-huh, or yeah, or answering questions she asks him, or nonverbally to look at her, or to somehow nod his head toward her. Those expectations of females are indications that a connection has been made. And so for females, there's a feedback loop built in to the act of listening. For males, there is no feedback loop. For males, the idea of listening does not include some kind of a indication that you are in fact listening. And so for males, what ends up happening is they expect a quieter lack of a feedback loop. You don't have to prove you're listening, which is why oftentimes when females try and interrupt or offer clarification questions or jump in and add something, males might get frustrated by that because they feel as if the female is trying to seize control of the conversation and place the male into a one-down position. And so from the standpoint of listening expectations, if you're male and you're listening to this part of the video lecture, you might want to think about making sure you provide the right kind of feedback for your girlfriend or your mom or your female supervisor at work, because they're likely having different expectations of listening than what you have. So that statement I said earlier is a common one. You're not listening to me. And as I said, that's tied up partly in terms of expectations of listening. But there's something else going on here also with respect to the statement, you're not listening to me. When a male hears a female say, you're not listening to me, what they think that statement means is, you did not hear what I just said. So from the male standpoint, it's centered on hearing. That's why the male is likely to repeat back whatever the last thing that was said. For females, on the other hand, that statement, "you're not listening to me," has less to do with hearing and more to do with meaning. So for females, the statement, "you're not listening to me," really can be understood to mean, "you don't understand what I said in the way that I meant it." Or the statement, "you're not listening to me," can actually mean, "you're not giving me the kind of response I expected." So from a male standpoint, when you hear the statement, "you're not listening to me," that could be a cue for you to check that you are in fact providing the kind of acknowledgement of being present in the communication. Or it's your cue to ask yourself, so do I really understand what was just said to me? And so the statement, "you're not listening to me," if you're male, can't be taken simply at face value. The next idea that shows the difference between the way males and females communicate has to do with details. Because females are connectively oriented, what we find in the research is that they tend to place a high value on details. So, for example, wives want the details of what their husband's day at work was when he comes home. Moms want the details of how their kids are doing during the fall semester of their freshman year at college. Those details are important because they're like individual strands of yarn that come together to individually create as a group something that is strong and something that is whole. So the details form connection points of a sort. And so the more details there are, the more likely it is that a connection will be made. And so females oftentimes complain that the males in their world don't share enough details with them. Those details not only allow for connection points, those details often become ways of indicating care and involvement. Because if you can provide someone with details, that begins to show some consideration that the topic you're talking about is important enough for you to have noticed those details and to have provided those details. And so if you're a male and you're dating someone who's highly detail oriented, it's important for you to provide those details to that person. For males, on the other hand, seeing the world through a lens of hierarchy, details are simply not that important. The reality is that for males, the only way that details become important is if those details are helpful in putting you into a one-up position. So for example, many males will provide details if those details allow them to prove their superiority to someone else. So let's say, for example, that a girlfriend happens to say to her boyfriend, "Yeah, I met that new freshman on the soccer team. He's really attractive." At that point, the guy might have also noticed some details about this guy because he's a rival. And the guy might talk badly about him and say, "I don't know, I think he's got bigger ears than he should have." Or, "I don't know, he's got all hairy legs, probably has a hairy back." So the male has noticed some details, but he's noticed and is now communicating those details because it allows him to put himself into a one-up position. Now, related to this is this idea of what you do with the details. So if details are a part of creating connection, it makes sense that females would want to share those details. So let's say, for example, that you've got Susan and Melissa, and let's say that Susan is dating Bradley. So Bradley and Susan have this relationship, and obviously they've got some difficulties with who knows what. And so Susan wants to talk to her good friend Melissa about her relationship with Bradley. She wants to vent a little bit. She wants to get her good friend's perspective on this relationship. And so Susan shares with Melissa some of the details about the things that she and Bradley fight about. Or she shares with her some details about the relationship that might make Bradley look a little bad. So when Bradley hears that his girlfriend Susan has been sharing details of their relationship with Melissa, he gets really upset because he sees those details as private. Those details have placed him in a one-down position in Melissa's eyes. And so he's now mad at his girlfriend Susan for having shared the details. But from Susan's perspective, she can't understand why Bradley's so upset, because after all, she was just trying to forge connection with her friend Melissa, and in doing so, she shared the details of their relationship. So for her, it's functional, it's beneficial. But for him, it's a betrayal of the privacy and the trust of the relationship. It's his business or their business and shouldn't be shared with other people. And by the way, research suggests that in this age of social media where people can post all sorts of stuff for all sorts of people to see, there are more conversations and more conflicts that occur between boyfriends and girlfriends over what kind of details about a relationship are posted on those platforms. Well, there are two more kinds of contexts in which we see these gender differences play out between males and females. One of them is interruptions. It's quite common in conversations for someone to interrupt someone else. You jump in and try and offer a clarification question, or you jump in because you want to try and make your own mark. Males and females tend to see interruptions through very different lenses. For males, since the world is all about hierarchy, to be interrupted is to be forced into a one down kind of position. Because when you're interrupted, your control of the conversation is interrupted. That, by necessity, puts you into a one down position. So males tend to look at interruption through a very different lens than females. They look at it as a violation. They look at it as an unexpected and unwanted attempt to put them into a one down position. That seizing of conversational control puts the status of the male in jeopardy. And so therefore males tend not to like to be interrupted. Now, never mind the fact that males will often interrupt themselves, because to be an interrupter is to place yourself into a one-up position, because minimally you've gained control of the conversation in that exact moment. Females, on the other hand, have a different kind of view of interruptions. They tend to see interruptions as a more natural portion of conversations. They indicate familiarity and closeness. Or to put it differently, because I know you well enough, I feel like I can interrupt you. So for females, the act of interrupting in an odd kind of a way is oftentimes an indication that in fact I feel close enough to you to be able to interrupt you. If I didn't feel close to you, I wouldn't interrupt you. So once again, we see the connective lens. But beyond that, we know that just in general, females are more apt to interrupt one another and interrupt other individuals, in particular in private settings. Now, why would that be the case? That would be the case because those interruptions are ways of creating a kind of connection where a connection might not have been made. Now, this notion of interruptions really fits in very nicely to the next idea in terms of gender differences in everyday communication instances. It has to do with what's called conversational ambiances or conversational environments. One of the things we know is that males and females have very different conversational ambiances in which they're comfortable. A conversational ambiance is this, let's call it a spectrum, in which we can place a conversation's air of confusion or chaos or uncertainty or just kind of give and take back and forth. So at this end, we have conversations that are very controlled. One person talks, the next person talks, one person talks, the next person talks. There's one voice at a time. People aren't talking on top of each other. There are no interruptions. There are no half sentences. It's all very linear. At the other end of the spectrum is a different kind of conversational ambiance where you have a lot of voices all at the same time. Think about a lot of background noise. Think about people cutting one another off and finishing their sentences. And think about people talking at the same time. Think about people laughing over the top of people's sentences. That is what's called a very high conversational ambiance setting, multiple voices. A low conversational ambiance setting is when there's a single voice. And so one of the things we know is that females oftentimes tend to favor those high conversational ambiance styles. They tend to be comfortable with multiple voices all talking at once, people talking over one another, people interrupting one another. That ambiance doesn't have very many gaps of silence. Those gaps are filled with some kind of verbosity or some kind of communicative interaction. And so rather than it being very linear with one voice at a time, those multiple voices create a situation where connections are being made left and right. It's as if everybody's participating. Think of it as a big ball of yarn or a big mishmash of an extension cord that is all tangled up. You've got lots of different strands all coming together, lots of connection points. That's the high ambiance kind of a style. Males, on the other hand, tend to prefer these low ambiance kinds of styles, the single voices talking at once, and they tend to favor those and be more comfortable in those because that allows the person who's speaking to be in a one-up position. And so males trying to be in that one-up position oftentimes create this low ambiance kind of a style. And so they might get overwhelmed, they might get frustrated if they're thrust into a high ambiance style where their voice can't be heard. And so they can't seize control of the conversation. They can't place themselves into a one-up position. And so that connects back to the interruptions, because in that kind of environment, the interruptions are likely to be seen from a male perspective as unhelpful. From a female perspective, they're seen as very natural. Now, again, I said earlier, males will interrupt. Don't get me wrong. It's not as if males don't ever interrupt. In fact, earlier we talked about the idea of a lecture, where because of a tone of voice, males oftentimes will talk down to or be perceived as patronizing females. That's true in part because males lecturing may interrupt. But what I am saying here is that though males will interrupt when they find it to their advantage, they don't like it when it happens to them. And it all too often is a situation where the interruptions are a part of the conversational ambiance. So those are 9 different ways in which the male and female lens of hierarchy and connection play themselves out in everyday situations. I hope you found that helpful. I hope you start to look around your world and see where all of those lenses make themselves known.